Three women walked into a small home in Springfield, Missouri, and were never seen again. No bodies, no crime scene, no signs of struggle, just an empty house. And a nation of investigators baffled for more than 30 years. This is the haunting disappearance of the Springfield Three. A case where every clue leads somewhere, until it leads nowhere at all. Welcome to InsightWave, the channel that delves into both solved and unsolved cases from around the world. If you haven't already, please take a moment to like and subscribe, to stay up to date with the latest crime stories delivered straight to your inbox. June 6, 1992. For most people in Springfield, Missouri, it was a night filled with bright futures, graduation gowns, and disposable cameras clicking nonstop. For two high school seniors, Suzie Streeter and Stacy McCall, it was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of their lives. They had just walked across the stage at Kickapoo High School, surrounded by proud families, laughing friends, and the energy of a summer just beginning. But the story of the Springfield Three doesn't start with their disappearance. It starts here, with a night that felt perfectly normal. Suzie's mother, Sherrill Levitt, was 47, a respected cosmetologist who worked long hours, was known for her warm personality, and was described by friends and colleagues as a hard-working, devoted single mother. She was born in Washington State, later moving to the Midwest, and eventually settling in Springfield. Cheryl married once, but by the early 1990s she was divorced and raising her daughter Suzie alone. Their relationship was exceptionally close, more like best friends than parent and child. Suzie, full name Suzanne Elizabeth Streeter, was 19. She had shoulder-length blonde hair, a bright smile, and a dry sense of humor. Friends described her as responsible, level-headed, and unafraid to speak her mind. According to one close friend, Suzie didn't sugarcoat things. She said what she felt, and you always trusted her because of it. She'd been working part-time at a local movie theater. She loved animals, cared deeply about her friends, and had plans for business school. She was also protective, especially of her mother. That bond would become one of the central mysteries of this case. Because whatever happened to them that night, investigators believe it happened together. Stacy Kathleen McCall, 18, was the youngest daughter of Janice and Stu McCall. Her parents had divorced years earlier but continued to co-parent peacefully, something Stacy appreciated. She was close with her mother Janice, who would later become the most vocal advocate for finding the missing women. Stacy was known for being gentle, soft-spoken, and kind to everyone. Her friends often said she had a lightness about her, the kind of person who eased tension just by being in the room. She and Suzie weren't best friends most of their school years, but during the last months leading up to graduation, their friendship grew stronger. They shared classes, shared frustrations, and at the end, shared celebrations. The day began early with family photos and caps adjusted in mirrors. It was hot, Missouri summer, humidity thick in the air. But spirits were high. After the ceremony, both families did what most families do. More pictures. Tears. Short speeches that embarrassed the teenagers. Then, one final round of hugs before the girls left for their post-graduation plans. That evening, Suzie and Stacy joined friends for a series of celebrations. Reports and interviews confirmed they attended multiple parties, moving between houses as the night went on. Everyone described the same thing. Nothing unusual. Nothing concerning. Just a group of teens enjoying one of the biggest milestones of their lives. Both girls were originally supposed to stay the night at another friend's house. But the house became crowded, too many guests, too little space, so they made a last-minute decision. They'd stay the night at Suzie's home instead. This single decision would place them at the very location where all three women vanished. Around 2 a.m. the girls left the final party. They planned to sleep at Suzie's home on East Delmar Street, where Cheryl was already in bed after a long shift at the salon. This moment, two girls heading to a quiet home in a safe neighborhood, is the last time anyone can place them with certainty. They weren't upset. They weren't acting strangely. They weren't followed, according to anyone who saw them. Police have emphasized this again and again. Everything about their night was completely normal. Nothing predicted what was coming. Around 2 a.m. the girls left the final party. They planned to sleep at Suzie's home on East Delmar Street, where Cheryl was already in bed after a long shift at the salon. This moment, two girls heading to a quiet home in a safe neighborhood, is the last time anyone can place them with certainty. They weren't upset. They weren't acting strangely. They weren't followed, according to anyone who saw them. Police have emphasized this again and again. Everything about their night was completely normal. Nothing predicted what was coming. There were no warnings in the air. No sense of danger. No premonition that the house they were walking into would become one of the most perplexing crime scenes in American history. A house with no bodies, no signs of struggle, and no trace of three women who simply vanished. By the late morning of June 7, 1992, the little home at 1717 East Delmar Street should have been buzzing with activity. Three women getting ready. A trip to Whitewater planned. A normal summer Sunday. Instead, the house stood still. And the first person to sense something was wrong was Janice McCall, Stacy's mother. Stacy was supposed to call when she woke up. She didn't. And Janice, who always described her daughter as dependable, felt a tightening in her chest that she couldn't ignore. So she drove to Sherrill and Suzie's home. When Janice arrived, the first red flag was obvious. Cheryl's red Ford Escort, Suzie's black Ford Mustang, and Stacy's Toyota Corolla, all still parked. All untouched. Stacy never left her car somewhere without telling her mother. This was the moment Janice later said she felt fear take hold. If Stacy was gone, her car wouldn't be. She went to the front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet and looked ordinary to Janice. Nothing out of place. But every detail seemed frozen, as if the women had simply paused life and never returned. The TVs were still on, humming quietly in the background. Neither woman normally left them running overnight. Near the front, something else stood out. The porch light fixture was shattered. Not just the bulb, the entire glass globe cover. And even stranger, someone had cleaned up the glass. Police would later say this was highly unusual, because whoever cleaned it up tried to erase the fact it had broken in the first place. But who did that? All three women's purses, Suzie's, Cheryl's and Stacy's, were lined up neatly side by side. Inside them, money, identification documents, credit cards, makeup, and cigarettes, everything exactly where the women always kept it. These weren't the belongings of people who walked out voluntarily. And they weren't dumped or rifled through by someone fleeing. Nothing was missing. The purses were simply waiting. Cheryl's bedroom was the first real sign that something wasn't right, not because it looked chaotic but because it looked lived in. The sheets were pushed back the way someone leaves a bed after a few hours of sleep. A book on the nightstand. And a pair of reading glasses nearby. But the most important detail wasn't what was there. It was what wasn't. Her cream-colored bedspread, the quilt she kept on her bed every single night, was gone. Not tossed aside. Not in the laundry. Not found anywhere in the house. Just gone. Detectives later said that the missing quilt has always bothered them, because bedding doesn't simply disappear. Some still believe it may have been used to carry something, or someone, out of the home. To this day that quilt has never resurfaced. Suzie's bedroom felt eerily similar. Her bed showed the unmistakable impression of someone who had slept there recently, sheets wrinkled, pillows slightly indented, the kind of ordinary details that should have been comforting. But in this context, they were chilling. On her dresser, her jewelry, hair ties, and everyday essentials sat untouched, exactly where she always kept them. Nothing taken. It looked as though Suzie had gotten ready for bed, climbed under the covers, and expected a perfectly normal morning. Whatever interrupted that routine didn't leave a trace. And then, the most human detail of all, the one that proved Stacy made it inside the house. Her clothes from the night before were folded neatly in the hallway. Her makeup bag was open on the vanity waiting to be used. Her hair products were lined up with the kind of familiar order that comes from habit, not panic. These were the belongings of a teenager settling in for sleep, not someone preparing to leave. Nothing was knocked over or seemed out of place. Nothing indicating fear, urgency, or any attempt to run. Investigators later said the same thing. Whatever happened in that house did not happen while these girls were awake. While Janice was inside the home, the phone rang. Hoping it was one of the girls, she answered. Instead, an unknown man whispered sexual, obscene comments into the receiver and then hung up. The phone rang again later, the same disturbing voice. Police later confirmed that the house had received similar obscene calls before the disappearance. To this day, no one knows whether it was a coincidence or a clue that investigators never managed to trace. When police eventually walked through the home, they were struck by the same thing everyone else had felt. There was no sign of a struggle and no forced entry. No blood anywhere. No broken furniture or overturned items. No signs of packing or leaving, and no sign the women ever made it past their morning routine. It was a home with every trace of 3 women living their lives. Except the women themselves. One investigator later said, "It was too clean. Too calm. That's what bothered us. Nothing in that house told us what happened. Only that something did." And from that morning forward, Springfield would never be the same. By early afternoon on June 7th, word had already begun to spread among the girls' friends that no one could reach them. And because this was 1992, before cell phones, before constant communication, the only way to check on someone was to show up at their door. So that's exactly what they did. What happened in the next couple of hours would become one of the greatest frustrations in the entire case. One by one, friends, boyfriends, and parents arrived at the Del Mar home. They knocked. They called out. But no one answered. The door wasn't locked, so people began letting themselves in. At the time, they believed they were helping. They were worried and confused. But in the process, they unknowingly walked through what would soon become one of the most puzzling crime scenes in U.S. history. Near the entryway, one of the friends noticed broken glass from the shattered porch light. Thinking it was simply an accident, maybe Suzie had bumped it the night before, they swept the glass together and threw it away. It was done with the instinct of someone trying to tidy up a friend's home. But that glass may have held fingerprints, or fibers, or microscopic evidence now gone forever. Investigators would later say, that porch light was one of the few signs something wasn't right, and it was cleaned before we ever saw it. As more people arrived, the house phone kept ringing. Remember, this was long before caller ID. Friends picked up the phone thinking it might be one of the girls calling for a ride or help. Instead, at least one friend reported something deeply unsettling. A man on the other end of the line made sexual, obscene remarks before abruptly hanging up. Another friend said they heard heavy breathing. Others recalled the caller sounding taunting, almost like he was testing whether someone was home. Police would eventually confirm that the house had a history of obscene calls even before the disappearances, but the timing? The morning 3 women vanished? It has never been explained. Could it have been a coincidence? Possibly. Or it could have been something far darker, a taunt, a signature, or the caller making sure no one was alive to pick up. By the time actual officers finally entered the home, hours after the women had been discovered missing, the scene had already been walked through by as many as 8 people. They had picked up items, cleaned areas without realizing it, answered phones, emptied ashtrays, moved personal belongings, opened doors and closets, and walked through every room, all done with the same good-hearted belief, but unintentionally they blurred the timeline. They erased who touched what and when. They smudged fingerprints that might have told the story. One detective later put it bluntly. We didn't lose the crime scene never had a chance. At first, everyone, friends, parents, neighbors, thought there must be a reasonable explanation. But as people kept arriving and no clues appeared, the atmosphere shifted. No notes. No signs of leaving. All personal belongings untouched and purses, keys, jewelry, neatly placed as before. And the most haunting detail of all. 3 women, all responsible, all close to family, all with cars and plans for that day, had vanished without leaving the slightest trace. Janice McCall later said, "That's when I knew we weren't just missing them, something had happened." The house on Delmar Street, once just a quiet home in a safe neighborhood, had become a place where answers dissolved into confusion the moment people walked inside. And from that moment forward, investigators knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened to Cheryl, Suzie, and Stacy, it happened fast and it happened quietly. And it happened before anyone realized the truth. To understand what may have happened inside the Delmar Street home, investigators knew they had to start with the woman who lived there, Sherrill Levitt. A mother. A talented cosmetologist and a quiet force in her community. And, as detectives would soon learn, someone who had been dealing with trouble in the months before she vanished. This chapter of the story begins long before June 7th. With a series of events that, decades later, still raise unsettling questions. Cheryl was 47 at the time she disappeared. Born in Washington State, she had worked for years as a hairdresser and cosmetologist after moving to Springfield. Clients described her as warm, funny, and someone who remembered every detail of your life, the kind of stylist people stayed loyal to for decades. She was also a single mother, extremely close with her daughter Suzie. Their relationship was tight-knit, supportive, and peaceful. Cheryl wasn't involved in drugs, didn't socialize with dangerous people, and didn't have a history that would flag her as someone with enemies. But beneath the surface, detectives uncovered something most people didn't know. Cheryl was quietly dealing with a situation that had made her uneasy. A situation involving threats, a court case, and one very strange discovery inside her own home. In the months leading up to the disappearance, Cheryl had been involved in a property dispute with a man connected to her ex-boyfriend. According to reports, tensions rose during the process, and Cheryl confided to at least one friend that she felt threatened. She was worried the dispute might escalate. Worried someone might retaliate. When investigators heard this, they paid attention. Because Cheryl was not known to exaggerate. If she said she felt uneasy, there was likely a reason. But there was an even stranger detail connected to that period. Something found inside her home that investigators could never fully explain. According to people close to Cheryl, she once found a cryptic message carved or scratched into one of the walls of her house. The message was never publicly detailed, detectives never confirmed the exact wording, but it was described as unsettling and personal. A violation. Or a warning maybe. Something that made her feel like someone had been inside her space without her permission. Did it connect to the court case? Did someone she angered decide to send a message? These questions have never been answered. But the timeline is chillingly tight. The message, the threats, and the disappearances all happened within months of each other. One of the earliest leads investigators followed didn't come from a dramatic tip or a suspicious person. It came from something simple, almost mundane, in Cheryl's everyday life. For a short time, she'd worked a circulation route for the Springfield News Leader. It wasn't glamorous work. Early mornings, quiet streets, the same blocks over and over again. But that routine, those predictable lonely drives through sleeping neighborhoods, caught detectives' attention. Because routines like that get noticed. As police retraced her steps, a darker possibility began to take shape. What if someone had watched her during those deliveries? Noticed that she lived alone? Learned the rhythm of her mornings, her stops, her schedule? A newspaper route isn't just a job, it's a pattern. And patterns can attract the wrong kind of person. The hours were early, before sunrise, when porch lights flickered on timers and most houses were sealed in silence. Encounters in that world of half-awake streets can feel accidental. But investigators knew they sometimes aren't. Some seasoned detectives still believe this angle hasn't been given enough weight. A stalker. A silent observer. Someone who saw Cheryl again and again until familiarity turned into fixation. And if that person had truly been watching her, then the horror of that night might not have been random at all. Not just Cheryl but her daughter Suzie, and Stacy McCall, who just happened to be there, could have stepped directly into the path of someone who had been waiting. The threats and the carved message as well as the predictable newspaper routine. Individually, none of these details prove anything. But together they painted a picture of a woman who may have been watched, maybe even followed, without realizing it. When asked years later whether Cheryl had enemies, detectives often said the same thing. Cheryl wasn't the kind of woman who made enemies. But she was the kind of woman someone could quietly obsess over. And that's the frightening part. Because if the person who took the Springfield 3 had been stalking Cheryl, or watching her home, then what happened that night might not have been random. It might have been planned. When investigators trace the history of the Springfield 3 case, one name rises above almost every other lead, every rumor, every tip that came in over the decades. A man with a violent past. A man familiar with abduction. A man who has hinted, more than once, that he knows exactly what happened. Robert Craig Cox. To understand why Cox became the primary person of interest, you have to understand his history. Cox is a serial offender with a long record. Kidnapping. Assault. Violent attacks on women. A prior conviction in Florida for kidnapping and attempted murder. And involvement in a California homicide case where the conviction was later overturned. He is a lifelong predator. A man with a pattern of ambushing women. A man who has repeatedly shown the ability to abduct without leaving a trace. And when the Springfield 3 disappeared in June 1992, Cox was in Springfield. Not just in the area. Not passing through. He was living there. And working there. That fact alone made him impossible to ignore. Detectives noted that his whereabouts during the hours that the Springfield 3 disappeared were unverified. Cox claims he was with his girlfriend that night. His girlfriend later told investigators she wasn't actually sure if he was home. The alibi fell apart. But without evidence of a crime scene, the contradiction wasn't enough to arrest him. Over the years, something began to happen that investigators still struggle to explain. Robert Craig Cox didn't just deny involvement in the Springfield 3 case. He talked, he hinted, and he teased about the case. And the worst part? He seemed to enjoy it. In several conversations with reporters, most notably a 1997 interview with journalist Catherine Lyon, Cox delivered statements that sent a shockwave through both investigators and the families. With a flat, steady voice he said, "The women are not alive. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just a cold declaration." When Lyon asked how he could possibly know that, he didn't blink. "I know they're dead. I know they were murdered." But he refused to explain further. He offered no details, no locations, no reasons. Then came the comment that left even seasoned detectives chilled. He said he would only reveal the truth when my mother dies. The implication was horrifying, as if he were keeping a secret deliberately, almost ritualistically, waiting for some grim personal milestone before speaking. For all his disturbing comments, for all the attention he invites, there is one huge problem. Nothing connects him to the crime. Police never found a witness who saw him at the Del Mar home. There's no DNA. No fingerprints. No confession. No physical trace linking him to Cheryl, Suzie, or Stacy. Not then, not now. On paper he looks like the perfect suspect. In reality, investigators say he's the weakest one they have. He's never been charged. He's never provided a single detail that could be verified or used. Just hints, shadows, and carefully chosen words. And that's the question that's hung over this case for more than 30 years. Is Cox withholding the truth? Or is he simply manipulating a grieving community because he enjoys the power? If he does know something, he's chosen to hide it behind cryptic statements and cruel timing. If he knows nothing, then he has spent decades inserting himself into one of Missouri's most painful mysteries for attention. Either way, neither answer brings anyone closer to the women who vanished. As years passed with no arrests, no bodies, and no definitive crime scene, investigators began turning to tips that once sounded too far-fetched. Because in a case with zero physical evidence, even the strangest leads couldn't be ignored. One of those leads, decades later, became known as the concrete theory. And for many people in Springfield, it remains the most haunting possibility of all. More than a decade after the Springfield Three vanished, a witness came forward with a disturbing claim. He believed the bodies of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall were buried beneath a hospital parking garage in Springfield. The tip wasn't random. The man said that at the time of the disappearance, he had information that someone poured concrete at an unusual hour, under unusual circumstances, on the site that later became a hospital parking structure. He didn't come forward earlier because he feared retaliation. But years later, guilt, or conscience, pushed him to speak. Investigators had heard strange tips before, but this one had timing, location, and a level of detail they couldn't ignore. So they took it seriously. In 2006, a specialist was hired to examine the area using ground-penetrating radar (GPR), a technology capable of detecting disruptions, voids, and shapes beneath concrete surfaces. When the GPR scan came back, it revealed something unexpected. 3 anomalies beneath the concrete floor. Roughly human-sized, clustered in a formation, located in an area consistent with early construction phases. The specialist described them as consistent with possible graves or disturbed soil that had been filled and then covered. Tearing up a hospital parking garage wasn't a simple matter of bringing in a shovel. It was an active, multi-level structure, filled with cars, patients coming in and out, staff moving between shifts, and equipment that couldn't just be relocated. To even consider digging, the hospital would have needed structural engineers to assess the risks, heavy machinery brought in to break the concrete, and a temporary shutdown of one of the facility's main access points. The cost alone would have reached into the hundreds of thousands. And even then, there was no guarantee they'd find anything beneath the slab. Investigators were blunt about it at the time. They couldn't justify tearing apart a functioning hospital without something stronger than a radar anomaly. They needed a confession, a credible witness, a piece of physical evidence tying the women to that exact spot. None of it existed. And so the garage stayed exactly as it was, the concrete untouched, the questions unresolved. Today, the hospital parking garage still stands. Cars drive up and down its ramps every day. People walk across the concrete to appointments, unaware that, according to one tipster, an entire mystery might be buried beneath their feet. The Springfield Police Department has never ruled the theory out, but they've never pursued it further. "30 years of searching and thousands of tips, dozens of suspects, and not a single piece of physical evidence. In the absence of answers, investigators have been forced to build a theory not from what they found, but from everything they didn't. And after decades of reviewing the scene, the timeline, and the behavior of the victims, most experienced investigators now believe the same thing. Someone was already inside the house." Theory 1. The intruder was waiting. Of all the theories explored over the years, one has quietly become the most convincing: the idea that the killer was already inside the house. Investigators kept coming back to the same unsettling detail. Nothing in the home showed signs of a struggle, and nothing outside suggested the women ever made it past the doorway. The scene felt frozen, almost undisturbed, as if the moment they stepped inside, control shifted immediately. That calmness didn't look like a forced entry. It looked like an ambush. Detectives believe the intruder may have been hiding somewhere in the dark. A closet, behind a door, maybe even in the bathroom, waiting for the perfect moment. And when the women returned home after their long graduation night, he revealed himself before any of them had a chance to react. The second major point investigators consistently agree on is that all 3 women were taken alive. Nothing inside the house, no blood, no overturned furniture, no signs of violence suggest that anyone was harmed there. Instead, the scene points to something far more chilling. The women were confronted, threatened, and subdued quickly enough that no struggle ever left a trace. In other words, the killer didn't come to murder them inside the home. He came to take them. A third theory many investigators accept is that the women were removed from the house in a single, swift trip. No neighbors reported screams, commotion, or repeated activity around the home that night. Everything points to a fast, efficient abduction carried out in one vehicle. Quiet enough that no one noticed a thing. That level of precision suggests someone experienced and organized, someone who knew how to control a scene and possibly even understood the layout of the home. This wasn't a chaotic snatch and grab. It was a controlled operation. The greatest mystery in this case isn't what happened inside the house. It's what happened after. Despite decades of searching, investigators have never uncovered a credible lead on where the women were taken. Their belongings stayed behind. The home remained almost eerily untouched. But the bodies, the key to unlocking everything, were never recovered. Over the years, every avenue has been explored. Tips, dig sites, suspect interviews, private properties, forests, quarries, caverns, farmland, even the concrete theory beneath the hospital. Not one has produced answers. Every lead fades into the same dead end. Silence. Until the disposal site is found, the case remains frozen in uncertainty, and impossible to solve with finality. After more than 30 years of digging, sifting, and re-examining every angle, most investigators now agree on one chilling outline of events. The killer was already inside the house. He confronted the three women the moment they walked in, gained control fast, and took them alive. The abduction was silent, efficient, and over before anyone nearby noticed a thing. What happened next remains the darkest void in the case. The disposal site has never been found despite decades of searches. No theory explains everything. But this is the one that best fits the evidence, and the unnerving lack of it. More than 30 years later, the disappearance of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall remains one of the most studied unsolved cases in American true crime history. It appears in criminology textbooks, where investigators use it to teach the importance and fragility of a clean crime scene. It has inspired documentaries, podcasts, and investigative specials, each trying to fill in the gaps that police never could. And in Springfield, the case is still spoken about with the same heaviness as the Beaumont children mystery in Australia, a disappearance so shocking it becomes part of a city's identity. The Springfield 3 belongs to that category. A case that doesn't fade. A case that lingers. Because people aren't just haunted by what happened, but by the complete absence of answers. Even today, the public continues to debate what happened inside that small home on Delmar Street. Theories range from grounded, to chilling, to possible. Maybe a serial offender, experienced enough to abduct 3 people without a trace. Or a stalker, fixated on Cheryl or Suzie, watching their routines until the opportunity appeared. What about a mistaken identity, tied to a drug-related grudge involving someone else? Someone known to the family, someone they opened the door for without hesitation. A stranger abduction, silent, opportunistic, fast, the kind investigators admit is rare but not impossible. None of these theories have ever been proven. None have ever been fully eliminated, making the case of the missing Springfield 3 a haunting one.